this session. So I'd like to introduce you to our two guests tonight. So firstly, welcome Zaki, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight.
That's great. So look, as a little bit of an introduction, Zaki is a Haidari refugee from Afghanistan. Zaki was targeted by the Taliban about the age of 17, and he was forced to flee Afghanistan in 2013. And he came to Australia by boat seeking asylum. He spent some time in our immigration detention centres, and he was eventually recognised as a refugee and then allowed to live in the community on a temporary visa. And since living in the community, Zaki has studied English and has since thrived in his studies, and he's completed a diploma in IT and in graphic design. And Zaki is a passionate human rights advocate and shares his experience with schools and with the wider community. And he dreams to one day be able to provide education and assistance to people in less fortunate countries in the way that he was given this opportunity in Australia. And secondly, I'd like to welcome Zach Quinn. Hi, Zach.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, a pleasure. So Zach's background, very briefly, he spent 6 months working on Asylum as a project manager supporting asylum seekers within the Australian government's offshore detention centre. And that experience formed part of the inspiration for him writing his fictional novel called Sanlundia, which is a novel about offshore detention of asylum seekers and what can happen when we allow the strong to abuse the weak. He's also the founder and managing editor of the DIST literary journal and a board member of Amicus, which is a charity that supports asylum seekers and refugees within the Australian community. So I think between Zaki and Zach, we'll have a very interesting two perspectives on the whole asylum seeker issue in Australia. So look, going back to Zaki, could I just start off by asking you, what are your favourite memories from your childhood growing up in Afghanistan?
I was living with my family, just a normal family, with my siblings, my dad and my mom. Not very long time before everything was taken away and things got ruined for us. We did have issues growing up, as Afghanistan has been in war and conflict for over 40 years now. But it's still like we had my father and my mom and my siblings around. So being with them, you know, growing with my siblings and my father and my mom, that's something that I really like and I miss now. Not be able to see them or even sometimes not be able to talk to them. Yeah, it's something that I think as a human being, I do miss that part of my life. And there's a hole in it that I don't have it.
Which is a very common experience, I guess, for refugees and asylum seekers around the world, and certainly reflected in a lot of conversations I've had with refugees here in Australia. What was day-to-day life like for you and your family, Zaki, in the period just before when the Taliban took your father?
Look, I was very young before I left my country. My father was very passionate about education because my generation, Hazaras, weren't allowed to go to school before my grandfather generation. So my father was the first man in the whole town, actually, who was allowed to go to school. And his passion was to provide that opportunity for his kids to go to school and create a future for them, in a way to serve the community the way he was. He was a doctor, and that's something that took him away as well. So he wanted us to be, you know, a key figure in the community, in a way to give back through education the way he was giving. He was a role model for us. So yeah, just going to school, encouragement from my father and my mom, just like normal day-to-day life. We did have challenges, like we don't have high school in our hometown. So when we meant to go to high school, we had to move to Kabul. to go to high school. And even that sort of being away from our family during high school was challenging. So that's some kind of lifestyle for a lot of Hazaras who are living in rural Afghanistan. It's not very rural. It's 2 hours drive from the capital, Kabul, where I'm from, called Wadak. But that's something that families would do from my hometown. The encouragement of education or being useful in the community.
And did you yourself move to Kabul for high school?
I did, yeah. So when I finished my primary school, I had to move with my older brother to Kabul to finish the high school and be able to go to university eventually, which I couldn't do that.
So Zaki, what happened? Why did the Taliban take your father, and what was the impact of that on you and your family?
So normally Taliban or the rebel group active in the areas or taking the key figures from the community, particularly people who work with the government or international NGOs or international forces. That's something that my father was a doctor and his clinic was in the hometown. So every time he was traveling, he had to go and get his medicine or all the equipment that he needed for his medical center. We kind of knew that wasn't safe for him because that sort of took a lot of lives and a lot of people were taken away. But my father was really passionate about, because he was a doctor and he was thinking that's not something that people would harm him because of his job or skill that he had. He would never listen to us. So he was kind of hoping that nobody will harm him.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to travel to Kabul very often. He was stopped a few times, and that sort of kind of trick a point where he had to stop and not operating his medical center in the hometown. But that was something that he wanted to do in his life. Like he saved a lot of lives. But unfortunately, in 2011, when he was coming from Kabul back to hometown, his van was stopped by Taliban and they searched his van. They found his documents that he had with him. Mostly medicine are imported from other countries in Afghanistan because it's very underdeveloped country. We don't make medicines. So most of the medicine are in English. So when Dad had to go pick stuff up, he had to write everything mostly in English. So they found his English documents with him and they sort of accused him for working with international forces or international NGOs. That's why they took him away. And since then, we haven't heard anything from him. We don't know if he's alive or if he's been killed. Normally what happens is when they take people away, they brutally kill them overnight and they throw the body on the road. So the next day when people travels, they pick the body. In my dad's case, we never found his body. Again, that was something that not only my father was accused, but the whole family was accused. So the tradition in Afghanistan is if someone is doing something wrong, the whole family will be accused. And you have to pay a price for it. And the price is normally blood. So someone has to go to them and they will kill that person. And that guilt is clean in a way, or you're not guilty anymore. And I was the oldest son in the family. So I was in the line for them to take me away.
So you sort of knew at that point that you would be, I guess, you'd be targeted, that you'd be next in terms of who they would try to take?
Yeah, they were sending people for us. They just wanted me to go to them, but we knew what would happen if I did go.
Right.
And that was the point that we had to leave everything in hometown, move to Kabul. Even then, it wasn't safe for us in Kabul. And that was the time when Mom had to decide to send me to a safer place.
Right. Okay. That must have been obviously very traumatic and a bit terrifying for all of the family. So then what happened? I guess, did you and your mother, you decided that you needed to flee, and you obviously ended up in Australia. Can you briefly describe that journey?
Yeah, so I was really young, as I said. Like, I wasn't really sure what would be a safe country for me, where to go. And that was Mom's decision more rather than me, to send me to a safe place. The whole journey was terrifying. It's sort of I don't wish that happened to anyone. It will destroy or ruin your whole life. Like, I still live with the memory or the trauma that I had to go through, beginning from when my dad was missing and the whole journey getting to Australia. It's a long journey. There's a video of me on Google, so people can find. It's very nicely produced. But the whole journey, it's a long journey, crossing many countries, getting through so many people in such a young age. It was terrifying, and it did leave me with a lot of trauma. Like, I couldn't sleep when I got in Australia for many years. I still have nightmares from the whole thing that happened in the journey.
So the journey itself was obviously, yeah, quite traumatic for you. What happened to you when you arrived? You ultimately came by boat, and correct me if I'm right, but you were about 17 when you arrived at Christmas Island. Is that right?
Yeah. So I did came by boat, and luckily in a way that we were rescued by the Australian Navy. We were on the sea for 5 days and nights on a broken boat. We were kind of lost in the sea without knowing where we were. And then we were rescued, taken to Christmas Island. And I was detained there for a couple of days before we were transferred to Tasmania. Yeah.
And so you would have been transferred to a detention centre in Tasmania, is that correct?
That's correct. So there was a detention centre in Hobart where I was detained for a couple of months.
Right. And then what happened? Like, at that point, were you then released into the community, or what happened?
Yeah, so my date of birth was changed. My actual date of birth wasn't accepted in Australia. I was made to be 18, and I was given a bridging visa, which allowed me to live in the community with no work rights and no access to education. Which then I really wanted to go to school and learn English at least. Yeah, I was transferred in Sydney. I don't have any family in Australia. I didn't have any friends back then. So life was challenging for me in that young age. If you see back now, almost 8 years ago.
Yeah. Were you able to find any Haidari community in Australia?
It was a slow process, but eventually, yeah, I did find the community.
Right. And so, since you've been out of detention, what sort of path has your life taken since then?
In a way, I feel lucky because the Australian community has given me a lot. I'm able to speak English at the moment. A lot of my friends didn't have the opportunity, and they still kind of speak English very well. I got the scholarship to go and learn English, and got the scholarship to go to college to skill up my skills. And to when I had my work right after 3 years, I was able to get a full-time job, which was very satisfying moment for me. That was the time that I didn't have to kind of wait for a Centrelink payment to come to my account so that I can survive. But actually, I was able to go and find a job and work full time. So that was the best moment for me. But yeah, and look, although I didn't have any work right or any opportunities from the government to go to college or learn English, but I did have the support from community where I could learn English or go to college and eventually be able to find a job.
And when you say you had support from community, what community are you referring to there?
So I had to, I put out my name that I really wanted to go to school, and through that went to a private college, which led up that I was able to get to receive a scholarship for the English. So that was the start point. It was word of mouth through people that they know someone who knows someone, But I did have an article online that helped a lot in finding the scholarship. It was an article which was written about my journey and my community back in Afghanistan, and what I want to do really, like coming here.
Yeah. And so, Zaki, what are you doing now, and what are your sort of hopes for the future?
I'm 25 years old now, and I have been working full time for the last almost 4 years now at the ANU, Australian National University in Canberra. That's a good question about my future. I don't have a future. My life is on daily basis because I live on a temporary visa and my visa is expiring next year in September. I don't know what's next for me, or even I don't know what's tomorrow for me. I don't have the privilege or to have a say in my future. I don't know when my visa will get cancelled or when I will be deported back to Afghanistan. So I have been living in sort of temporary future, like tomorrow is my future. In that sense, I have lived for almost 8 years, but that hasn't stopped and still going. I don't know what's my future. I have two futures. One is the fact and one is the fiction. So the fact is that I don't really know. The fiction side is that I really want to go to university and finish a degree, something that my dad always wanted, and to have a future. You know, I want to have a future where I can plan what's 2 years from now for me, what's 5 years from now for me, what will be when I'm 30, like what will be my future, or when I'm 40, when I'm 50. So I can't have those plans. It's something that I can dream about it. It's something that I can think of it, but it's fiction, you know, it's something that maybe that will happen or maybe it won't happen.
So it sounds like at the moment your future is still very much at the whim of the immigration department, depending on when they, review your visa and what decision they make each time.
Sadly, it is. Yeah, it is. Like I call Australia home emotionally, like feeling wise. I call Australian community my community after living here for 8 years. But it still depends with the immigration policy and where it will lead me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for those comments. That's really interesting and very valuable to hear that firsthand from you. I might swap over to Zach now. So Zach, can I get you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to being, I guess, part of this conversation today?
Sure. Well, my journey is certainly not as dramatic or traumatic for that matter as Zaki's, but I kind of view my life these days in two parts. There's the pre-Manus Island life, and there's everything since Manus Island. Sometimes I really struggle to remember what life was like before I went to Manus, and I certainly came back from working there a completely different person. I've lived in Australia pretty much all my life. I spent a few years in the UK, but apart from that, I'm born and bred Australian. For one reason or another, I volunteered to go to Manus Island and to work as a support worker with the Salvation Army. This would have been January 2013, I think, and I ended up being there for about a 6-month period in total. Not really knowing what I was getting myself into. I just felt at the time like I wanted to give something back, and I felt like I wanted to do something positive for people. And this opportunity came up through my partner, Catherine, who had previously been working on Nauru when the camps had just reopened. In case people don't know too much about the history, the detention centres on Manus and Nauru were reopened at the end of 2012 by a Labor government at the time. So by the time Catherine and I arrived at these places, they had just reopened. They were just beginning to fill up with people. That also meant that the conditions there were pretty appalling. It's almost impossible for me to imagine that a facility that's funded by the Australian government and essentially run by the Australian government could be so simple and basic. And when you walked into the detention centre there, everything was dirt and rocks and seashells. There were big fences everywhere. A lot of the people were living either in tents or in rusty old shipping containers. Manus Island's a beautiful place, but it's also very hot and humid and very poor.
Mm.
So access to facilities there are almost non-existent. So the Australian government, in its eternal wisdom, decided to reopen an open-air prison there with, and again, if anyone isn't sure, Manus Island is a little island north of Papua New Guinea. So it's on completely the opposite side of Papua New Guinea to Port Moresby. So even from the capital city of PNG in Port Moresby, it's a very long journey by plane or boat to be able to get any goods to Manus Island. It's just about the worst place in the world to set up an immigration detention centre, apart from perhaps Nauru, which is where the Australian government set up the other detention centre. So I did work there for about 6 months. It completely changed my life and my view of what it is to be Australian, and of the sorts of things that the Australian government can do in the name of people like me. It's the sorts of things I saw there, the sorts of things I've read about in history books, things that have happened in poor countries with dictatorships and autocracies and those kind of things. Like it's something I never imagined seeing Australian government representatives being responsible for. A lot of it I can't talk about because I've been bound to a non-disclosure agreement, quite a significant non-disclosure agreement, as are all the other stuff, anyone who worked on Manus and Nauru. And that's been a big part of the problem. There's just this incredible amount of secrecy around these Australian taxpayer-funded facilities. So the Australian government's decided to spend billions of dollars of taxpayers' money without any sort of overview or any sort of ability for people to actually understand how that money is being spent. And that was the most ridiculous thing about it as well. One of the most ridiculous things. There were billions of dollars literally spent on these facilities, and they were just in appalling condition. So much of that money was wasted. I still try to figure out where a lot of that went. It certainly didn't go to improving facilities for the people who were there. As I said, I can't really talk much about the things that I witnessed there, but there is one story I do have to tell people, especially when I'm talking to other Australians about my time there. And that was when I was told that there was a protest going on in the families camp, which was the part of the detention centre for families and for children. And I was still not quite sure why, but I was given the job of going there and trying to talk these people out of their protest. It was essentially a silent protest. But there were 3 people standing there at the gate protesting and wondering why they weren't allowed to go out. I was told this in the office. I didn't really know much about it. I thought, okay, fair enough. I can see why people would be protesting about their treatment there. So I walked out, and as I approached the fence, I saw that those 3 protesters were 8-year-old children. And there were 3 children standing behind this fence constructed by the Australian government in this remote tropical island with no facilities, with snakes crawling through the tents and mosquitoes and malaria. And I was given the job as essentially a representative of the Australian government to try and talk these 3 children out of their silent protest. And that was the moment that struck me more than anything else, when I realized this is just ridiculous. I never imagined my government being responsible for something like this. These 3 kids who had done nothing wrong, who didn't have a clue why they were there, and they weren't even asking for long-term freedom. All they were asking for was to be let out of the gates so that they could play with the local kids. That's all they wanted. And that apparently would have been too much of a concession on the part of the Australian government. It's appalling that adults are treated this way. But when you're actually face to face with children who have been treated this way as well, when you go and you spend some time with your nephews and nieces, or your brothers and sisters and the like, and you realize that if we were in another country, and if we happened to be in the situation that they were in, that could have been my brother in there, my nephew, my niece, my child. And it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough for the Australian government to be responsible for that. So I don't want to talk too much about the toll that this experience took on me, because it's nothing compared to the sorts of things that Zaki has been through. But I came back from Manus Island pretty much a broken person. My trust in government had just evaporated overnight. I was mentally and physically exhausted. Since then, I've had to go on antidepressants because I've been diagnosed with depression. I still have nightmares and wake up sometimes in the middle of the night thinking about some of the things I've seen. There's things like, I've had quite a few people recommend to me I think it's on ABC, a show called Stateless, which sounds really interesting, but I just can't watch it. It's about an immigration detention centre, and I think my partner Catherine is probably the same. We just can't bring ourselves to watch it because it just takes us straight back. I came back from Manus expecting that the camps would be closed because they were disgraceful, and it was only a matter of time before people found out what was really happening there. And by the end of that year, the camps were getting fuller and fuller. And then, so the next year, I assumed something would happen, and the camps kept being filled up with people. I would read the news. When I first came back from Manus, actually, I would read the news sometimes of an event that I witnessed on Manus, and the story would be completely different from what I'd witnessed. I've always been a fan of George Orwell and his dystopian novels. I spent 6 months living in a George Orwell dystopian novel. And when I came back, the double speak, as Orwell would call it, was just, again, if I was living in maybe I would expect that kind of thing. But to be an Australian citizen and witnessing this sort of thing firsthand, just shocking. So eventually I decided I had to do something because the camps were still open. And that was when I decided to try my hand at writing a novel. And I spent a couple of years writing Sanlandia, and they were easily the two most difficult years of my life, other than the 6 months I spent on Manus. That took me back to a very dark place as well, but I felt that I had to do something. And I didn't want to write a non-fiction book as well, because there are quite a lot of non-fiction books out there about these issues, and there's some really good books out there, and people should read them. But I wanted to also try and get to non-activists and reach an audience outside of people who already know that this is shocking. Not the people who hate foreigners and always will. I don't think there's much that can be done to change their mind, but there's a big chunk of the Australian population that just don't really know that much about this issue.
Right. Yeah.
They don't. It's not something they really think about a lot. It's not in their face. They probably don't know any refugees or asylum seekers. So it's not as if they don't care or they're bad people or anything like that. It's just that they're not really aware of the facts because there's been so much secrecy around it, and the government doesn't allow journalists to report the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, Zach, perhaps I'll pose a question for both you and Zaki, and you can bounce it back and forth between the two of you. But why do you think that the Australian government treats people who seek asylum, treats them so harshly and so unjustly?
Do you want to go, Zach, first?
No, you can go, Zaki. You've been on the receiving end, so.
It's a question I think that everyone should ask themselves. There will be many reasons that I'm not aware of why, but I think the main reason would be just, I really don't know. I don't have an answer, but being a person who lived through the experience of living my country in that situation and seeking a safe place, or sought a safe place through my mom or myself, it's, I don't know, maybe there's a big junk in it.
Zaki, I think you're exactly right. I think that's a fantastic answer right there. It just doesn't make sense. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out why the government has decided to pursue these sorts of policies. to my mind, there's one reason that counts more than anything else, and that's politics. It's pure and simple politics. This policy was and always has been about winning elections in Australia. It's always been about domestic politics. And to our eternal shame, Australian politicians have used human lives in order to stir up a frenzy. And it happened 20 years ago in 2001, where this whole policy started with John Howard and the Tampa. And it's pretty much been going on ever since then. And every time a political party looks like they're in trouble, they decide that this is a vote winner to pick on asylum seekers and refugees. And unfortunately, people like you, Zaki, ended up being, suffering the consequences of internal politics within Australian political parties. And that's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. And it's not just the Liberal Party either, it's the Labor Party. When I was on Manus Island, I had a Labor Party minister walking through the camp pretending to care. It's not just a left and a right wing issue. This is an issue that both major political parties have been responsible for. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Zaki.
Yeah, I can't really speak a lot. Like, I can't answer to a lot of questions because I still am on a temporary visa.
Yeah.
Although I did mention I'm not really allowed to speak publicly about a lot of stuff, so I'll probably give it a go.
Yeah, and look, and this is Australian democracy in 2020. We have people who are scared of speaking out about the things they've been through. Again, I mean, how did we end up living in 1984? I just don't know. When did that happen? I don't remember voting for that.
You're right. Both the victims are not allowed to speak out, and the eyewitnesses to the events, like Manus and Nauru, are not allowed to speak out. It's a very tight secrecy lid put on the whole thing. I'll go to perhaps the opposite question in that, from a community perspective, like, given your interactions, both of you, with the general Australian community, why do you think that so many Australians appear to support or at least accept Australia's treatment of asylum seekers?
I have been speaking in the communities and schools. I have met a lot of Australian, and I have some amazing friends from Australian community. They call me brothers, and I call them brother and sister. And I do feel like I do have a family now in Australia. I think there's there's a gap that has been created between asylum seekers and refugees to the Australian community. People who are out or accepting refugees or friends with refugees, they met someone, End of the day, we're a human being. We have families, we have communities back home, but things are not working out there, and we have to find a new place, a new community where we can feel safe, where we can feel part of community. I don't feel that in my home country. Being from Afghanistan, it's a shame thing to say, but I don't belong to my community. And that's the reason that I had to leave. And that's the reason for a lot of refugees and asylum seekers to leave their home country. Otherwise, why would someone leave if they have a nice community or if they are safe in a place where they are? But through my journey in Australia for over 8 years, the people that I met, they know me as a human being. They know my story. They know where I'm coming from, and they know that I'm just a normal human being. And I think that's lacking in the community. So a lot of people never come across from someone who has been in a refugee camp or who is coming as a refugee. And for people who know someone, it's just a friend, The whole issue will come down to the person that you meet or someone that you know. That will change the picture, I guess. That's my experience from the people in Australia.
Personal interaction and understanding rather than just what you see or hear in the papers and stuff.
Yeah, it's not always about money or the numbers of people coming and the way they come to Australia. It's about humans. It's just like a human connection. It is hard. It is hard to sort of, for people in asylum seeker or refugee status to get out and to be exposed in the community. There are a lot of restrictions. But I think at the end of the day, it is about the personal connection and human interaction.
And Zach, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think Zaki's hit the nail on the head there. It's a big part of it is it's hard to get to know. A lot of Australians don't really know asylum seekers and refugees in person, and what they do know about asylum seekers and refugees tends to be information fed to them by the government or by people who have, you know, certain political bents in the media. And there's a lot of fear mongering that goes on. That to me is ridiculous, because I worked in a place where I was surrounded by asylum seekers who were put in just about the most desperate situation you can imagine, at least in the Australian system. And those people that I worked with, they were doctors, they were scientists, there were teachers there were plumbers, there were writers, there were entrepreneurs. You know, they were people who were just like anybody else in Australia. They were just like any of the other migrants. Australia is a nation of immigrants. It always has been. And those immigrants, those refugees, those asylum seekers have made Australia the stable, rich country that it is today. They're generally people like you and me that just want, all they're asking for is to be able to live in safety and have a bit of stability. And I think another part of the problem, and Zaki kind of alluded to this a bit earlier, when I've spoken to some people who are, I guess you could say, anti-asylum seeker, one of the common things I hear is that they're all on welfare, they're bludgeoning off the state, and taxpayers shouldn't have to foot the bill. The point I have to make all the time is there's two things on that. One, they're forced to be on welfare. They're not allowed to get a job. They're not allowed to get an education. They're not allowed to pay taxes. They're not allowed to start a business. That's a big part of the problem right there. It's not their fault that they're on welfare, because they're not allowed to do anything else. The second thing I would say, and there's some good information out there. I saw a funny video just recently about this. The cost of offshore detention is absolutely ludicrous compared to even just processing asylum seekers onshore in Australia, but then compared to processing people in the community. The costs are astronomical. And it's literally billions of dollars of taxpayers' money that just has gone down the toilet, and all so that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party can use the issue to try and win an election.
What do both of you think that Australia should change in its treatment of people who seek asylum?
Zach, do you want to go first?
Yep. Well, I mean, again, I think Zaki had a really good answer before. It's just treat people like people. These are human beings. They're just like us. You know, they have the same aspirations, the same fears. It's the very first place we should start, and I think every government policy should start this way, is how does it harm human beings? And if it harms people, then it's a bad policy. Come up with a better way of doing it. You know, the welfare thing, I think, is a good example here as well. Let asylum seekers and refugees get some work, even if it means they have to be on visas that send them to regional areas and they're working on farms or whatever. Fine, just let them have the opportunity to support themselves and to pay taxes and to build something. I really don't think that's probably asking too much. And I think the whole processing system needs a significant injection of cash. Bring some of those, stop spending billions of dollars on Manus Island and Nauru, and spend a fraction of that to actually go towards the immigration department's budget so that they can speed up the processing of asylum seekers and refugees. And the last thing I'd say, and I know this is a bit controversial, maybe we should stopping the creation of asylum seekers and refugees, because I think a lot of Australians don't really think about this, but we are also responsible for creating refugees and asylum seekers. We've fought in every conflict with the United States since World War II. We've bombed the hell out of Vietnam. We've bombed the hell out of Afghanistan. We've bombed the hell out of Iraq. We've got troops and aircraft and ships that have been involved in these conflicts that have created refugees and asylum seekers. So that would be the very first thing that I would do, is just stop creating them in the first place. Stop forcing, being part of the problem.
The people who have joined us for this meeting on Zoom today what can they do to bring about change in some sort of tangible way?
I don't know. It could be a lot to ask, but I think it's my personal opinion. I'm sure everyone would have their own opinion. Is the power is still in the community, you know. If we are out for a change, the change will happen slowly, but eventually it will happen. I have been in Australia for 8 years, as I said, and Zach mentioned that people could go to rural Australia or towns where they can find job. And I was living in Sydney before for 4 years before moving to Canberra. The only reason I moved to Canberra from Sydney was because of my visa. I have to live in rural Australia for 3.5 years before I'm eligible to apply for other type of visa. And I have been living here. I have been working full time, and still nothing is clear for me on when and how I can, if I'm eligible to apply for other visas. So future and things are still blurry for a lot of people in my situation. But to your question is how people can take an action is, call local MPs or write letters. Those are the things that I would recommend, or get involved with organizations who are supporting or fighting for refugees. It's about like community education. I'm sure that a lot of people who are here tonight, they met someone, or some of their friends are connected with refugees, or they want to learn more. And I think that's something unfortunately missing in the community, you know? I think we need to reach out to more people who are not aware of asylum seeker, who are not aware of refugees and what's going in the community, who are in our backyard, right? Like nobody would know if I'm a refugee or what I'm doing here, where I'm coming from, why I'm leaving my country. So those are sort of things that people can do, like try to share this story, or to a friend, to family, to spread the word. If you believe that I'm someone here tonight that I deserve to be in Australia, right? I think a lot of people in the community are missing on that. It's hard to come across a refugee or asylum seeker, but there are organizations who are working with them, there are resources available for them. So reach out to those organizations like RACS that I'm ambassador for them. They're fighting for the rights for asylum seekers to get them stay in Australia. Or there are a lot of other organizations, which I'm sure we will share after the session.
And Zach, did you want to add anything to that before we go to general questions?
Yeah, just quickly, I'm a little bit old school. I believe that Australia is still a democracy. Change happens at the ballot box. That's where. I mean, this is a government policy. It's a political policy. The only way it's going to change is if politicians change the policy, and they're only going to change that policy if we put pressure on them to do that. And there's so many people out there, and I've spent a lot of last year and a bit of earlier this year before COVID-19 doing author talks and meeting people from all over Australia and New Zealand who are active in this space and working in the community. And I think some of them are probably on this call tonight, and they're doing an incredible job of getting out there and pressuring politicians and protesting and talking to people. We just need to build a group of allies one at a time. Just talk to people, just get them to do a little bit of research about this issue, and just one by one start to build those allies. There is a subsection of the community that will never be open to this idea. There's nothing that can be done about that, but the vast majority of Australians in the middle here, I think, they're open to the idea of a fair go for all. So if we can talk to them and just try and convince them that this is actually a bad thing, not just for the others, not just for foreigners, but for us as well, then that's the only way we're going to make a difference.
That's great. Look, thank you both for those comments. Look, we might open it up to questions from the audience, and I'll just make a comment. I will actually add, while we're answering some of these questions, I'll add to the chat some details on ways that you can help bring about change with links to petitions, a link to the books and Lundia, and other things. So I'll add some of those into the chat as we go. But I might hand over to Nico. You'll need to unmute yourself, Nico, who's going to ask some of the questions that have come in from the chat group. So over to you, Nico.
Okay, hi. There was one from Pat Rayner to everyone. No, hang on, it was above there. It was about what are the consequences for speaking out that you both face, if you do, Zaki and Zach. And that was from, I've lost the little thing. Someone here asked that question.
Pat Rayner, I think it was.
Faye, I think. Faye,
oh, okay.
Here. Zach, what kind of penalties would you face for speaking out about your experiences? And I guess the same applies to yourself, Zaki.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind, I'll just mention that one first because I suspect the consequences for Zaki are probably worse than for me. I did sign a non-disclosure agreement when I went to Manus Island. I had I had no idea what to expect when I went there. I certainly didn't think. It was like signing up to an iTunes account. You know, you just you accept the terms and conditions without thinking too much about it, with zero idea of what you were about to expect. I've had people I know who are in a similar position to me that have been threatened by the Australian government to be sued for potentially millions of dollars. And most of the people that I worked with, they don't have the sort of money to be able to defend a lawsuit against the Australian government, because you need to pay lawyers a lot of money to defend that sort of thing. You know, I've known people who work there and weren't necessarily Australian citizens, and they've been threatened with being deported just for speaking out about the things they saw on that island. Some of the people, you know, I've had to endure some trolls on the internet as well. I know some people who've written books and the like have received death threats from people out there. The one thing that probably does concern me more than anything else is that I do sometimes wonder what the Australian government is doing in the background about people who speak out on this sort of thing, because history is full of people who thought it would never happen to them until it did. And only, I think it was last year, we saw the newspaper offices being raided by the Australian Federal Police, not just the lefty ABC, but the right-wing News Corps. You know, journalists on both sides of the spectrum have been targeted by the government over this sort of issue. There's even and I don't know all the details, but there's a situation that came out just recently with a prisoner in jail in Canberra who was imprisoned there in an entirely secret trial. Nobody knew any of the details about it. They didn't know what that person was charged with. The trial happened completely in secret, and all of a sudden this person popped up as a prisoner in an Australian jail. I mean, we're heading down the wrong path. The signs are not good. And the problem is, once you start allowing your politicians to think that it's okay to harm other people, it's not that long before they start thinking that they can turn on you.
And Zaki, is there anything you'd like to comment on just in terms of consequences for yourself?
Yeah, look, I'm nobody. Like, I'm an asylum seeker. I don't have an Australian citizenship. I probably couldn't go on a trial or something if I did get detained back or get deported back, because I'm not saying anything in terms of politics. What I'm saying is, I'm a human being. I am from another country seeking asylum in here. And sometimes that could put people in a situation where they could be deported back or they could be detained back. So sadly, yeah.
And that's the problem. Zaki, you know, I mean, I can face some issues, but Zaki could potentially be sent back to a place where his life was under threat. I know there's serious consequences to sending people back to some of these countries, and we kind of don't realize that sometimes. Afghanistan is still not a safe place at all. And no asylum seeker for Afghanistan should be sent back there.
No, in reality is a lot of asylum seeker or Hazaras from Afghanistan, and we still been targeted. Not long time ago, even during COVID-19, Daesh or ISIS went to this hospital where it's located in Hazara community. They killed newborn babies, pregnant women, mothers who just have kids for a couple of hours, only because they were Hazaras. We cannot go to school. My cousin was targeted in school where they walk into the classroom and they open fire on the student. We can't go to mosque, like we can't go to community gatherings. They still targeting Hazaras in Afghanistan. And it's not safe for a single thing to do in Afghanistan. You cannot even go and work on daily basis. You never know when they will come and blow a bomb next to you. So my siblings are still in Afghanistan and I don't know how long they have. My siblings go to university with the fear that when the terrorists will walk into a classroom and shoot them, because it has happened and still happening. So that's the country where I'm like coming from, or I'm speaking on behalf, especially for my people.
Thank you, Zaki. There's another question from Janina, and she says that politicians don't only respond to public opinion, but also to economic powers. Would there be any hidden reasons why they will continue to reject asylum seekers? So what do you think? Would there be any hidden reasons, stuff that we're not really aware of?
I don't think there's really much in the way of hidden reasons. I think it's just pretty much politics more than anything else. I mean, think about politicians. When you become a politician, what you want to do is serve in government. In order to serve in government, you have to win an election. Really, everything comes around to winning an election. If you win an election, you've got the chance to become a minister, you get the fancy car, you get a big pay rise, and you get to have real influence on policy. But you can't do any of that. The worst outcome for a politician is to go into opposition. So they pretty much will do whatever they need to do in order to win an election. We're about to see that in the United States over the next few months. On a much more significant scale than here, I think. So to me, at the end of the day, it still just really comes down to politics more than anything else. If there are economic reasons for this policy, it absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. I think the Treasurer should probably go back to school if that's the case, because they've spent so much money on this. It's insane. So much of that money has been wasted. And at the end of the day, from an economic point of view, Australia's economy has managed to avoid recession over the last 20 or 30 years because of immigration. It's the one thing that has helped the Australian economy to stay growing year after year. And part of an immigration program is a program to accept asylum seekers. So if anything, you could increase that program and that would increase economic growth. So if there is a hidden reason, I'd love to know what it is. But to me, it's pure and unadulterated politics.
Okay, well, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I think, there's another question from Janina, that one that probably tortures you, Zach, unfortunately, but she asks, did you think something wasn't right when you had to sign the non-disclosure agreement?
No, because pretty much anyone who works for a government department or even a big corporation, in my pre-Manus life, I worked for some big corporations and I had to sign non-disclosure agreements. They're part and parcel of that sort of corporate life and government life as well. So no, I didn't really think much of it at the time.
I might just jump in there if I can, Zach, with a question of my own about that. Mm-hmm. Because if they didn't fully disclose to you why you had what you had to not disclose, then you couldn't really have given informed consent when you signed it. I mean, have you thought of challenging that non-disclosure agreement and the legality of it? Or?
Sure. Look, Nico, if you want to fund my legal campaign and get Julian Burnside, look, if you can get Julian Burnside pro bono, go for it. But look, it's not even just about the financial aspect of it as well. It's a big part of it is if you go down this road, you're bringing up the trauma again. Now, in part of my author talks, I've gone around and I've caught up with people who used to be support workers who I work with on Manus. And it destroys me to know that they're all in the same situation that I'm in. They all are scared of talking out. When we worked on Menace, we were told all of our social media was being monitored by the Department of Immigration. We know people who were sent home without any explanation other than the fact they posted something on Facebook or Instagram, something really, that wasn't particular. It wasn't bad in any way at all. It was something quite minor, but. And we've gone through a lot of people have gone through counselling, spent thousands of dollars on counsellors and medication and the like. There's Australian citizens out there that are really hurting because of this policy. So even if we could speak out on a lot of this stuff, there's a reluctance to do so. And just the last thing I'd quickly say on that as well, this is one of the hardest things for me to admit, but there is a nagging sense of guilt that I can never get rid of. It's a little blemish on my soul. And I know that other people who worked on Manus and Nauru have the same, because we went there to help. But ultimately we were paid to be there. And those wages were essentially paid by the Australian government. We ended up being part of the system. And even today, I still have some guilt over that. And I know everyone else who worked there did. So that's why when I do events like this, I usually need to take a few days afterwards just to decompress and just clear my head again, because it really takes a lot out of me to talk about this. You can't understand the bitter disappointment that I feel about my government, the people who are supposed to represent me. It just eats me up inside. Sorry for the long answer, but.
No, it's very insightful. And I must say, from a previous talk that we've done with you, Zach, it really struck me like your description of, I guess, the trauma that you experienced in terms of psychological trauma from working on Manus, and how pervasive that is amongst almost everybody who's worked there. Yeah. And you think, that's just the witnesses.
That's exactly right.
That's not the people who were the subjects of the maltreatment and the injustice. Just the witnesses to it are quite traumatized. You can't really imagine how much it must affect the people who have been the victims of that mistreatment.
And Kevin, look, that's a good point too, because that's another reason that a lot of support workers don't speak out, because they don't want to take the highlight off the asylum seekers who are treated so much worse. And I've had some of my fellow support workers mention to me that I shouldn't be speaking out about the impact on support workers, because it should all be about asylum seekers. And I understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, Zaki is more than capable of explaining his position and what has happened to him. To the Australian public. I also want to be able to tell people that it's not just asylum seekers who are suffering, it's also Australian citizens. And that's another reason why this policy has failed miserably.
Look, we are up to time, so I might just call for any final comment from both Zaki and Zach. And I guess that's what message would you like people to take away from this conversation tonight? And over to you, Zaki, first.
Well, firstly, thank you for coming to this session. It's amazing to see so many people are attending. Secondly, as I did mention this before, it's about educating your friends and families, or get out. And if you do believe that this is an issue, and if you're keen to get on to solve it, or at least be part of the campaign, is just talk to your friends, to your families, or people who don't have much information about refugees and asylum seekers. It's a matter of education and how we can go. And as Zach was saying, how we can educate one or two persons, and that could lead to the whole community. It's just to start from somewhere. If we can educate one person today about it, then I'm sure it will grow over time. And also, just be out and get involved with organizations who are volunteering with refugees and trying to help them out. And thank you. And I am grateful for Australian community. And I have said this before many times. I am very grateful for the opportunity that I have had in Australia, and I think it has been the most significant years of my life. Although I did have my ups and downs, but I did have some good times. I graduated from a college, which was very you know, which I was very proud of, and something that I probably couldn't achieve back in my home country. So I feel like, you know, days that I'm here, I feel like I'm a normal human being. I'm part of community, although I don't know what's tomorrow. And I think that's something that Australian community made it happen for me, you know. So very grateful for the opportunity I had here, and thank you for everything that Australians are doing for refugees, not only for me and asylum seekers.
Thanks, Zaki. And Zach, did you want to add anything in terms of the key message?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Zaki. To me, I just want people to think. It's as simple as that. Just think about the issue. That's why I wrote a book, because I wanted to make people think. I just want people to think about what would it be like if it was you in that situation, if it was your children. For people who are watching tonight, think about what you would do if you were in Zaki's position, and what it would be like, and how would you want to be treated when you finally got to a place that was going to offer you safety. There's I'm sorry to religious people out there, but there's a verse from the Bible, something along the lines of, if apologies if I get this wrong, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. And I'm not a religious person, but that's a rule I try to live my life by. If you're making decisions about asylum seekers in the Australian government, that is a rule that you are not living by at the moment. And I think once you start thinking about it that way, what would happen if it was my family that had to flee in the middle of the night, then you start to realize that maybe it's not okay to treat people like this.
That's great. Thank you, Zach. So look, it is time to wind up. So I will unmute everyone. Yep, done. I think I've done that successfully. So that we can just have a round of applause and thank you. Thank you so much, Zaki and Zach, for giving us your time tonight and your insights. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Zaki.
No problem.